under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. All right, we have an agenda in front of us. Any changes or modifications to the agenda? Hearing none. We have a motion to approve the agenda with no further discussion. All in favor say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Unanimous. And we get to jump right in with the fun stuff on employee recognition. Dr. Heil.
Chair Meisner and board members, it's with pleasure that I announce the October Employee of the Month, and that would be our maintenance lead at Fridley High School, Rabbit Rexa Happy. The Fridley School District and the Fridley Maintenance Team is very proud to present Rabbit with Employee of the Month award. This award is for his hard work, his great attitude, his attention to detail, and outstanding customer service. His politeness and can-do attitude are reflected in an increased quality of interactions that he has with staff and students. Furthermore, his patience and helpfulness represents the core values of Fridley Public School District. Rabbit works at many of our buildings in our district, and whenever you see him, he always has a smile on his face, and he has a willing to help personality. We want to thank him again to Rabbit for all of his skills, his hard work, his personality, and his professionalism in serving the Fridley Public School District.
Excellent, wonderful, and congratulations. Thank you, Dr. Howell. And next also, we have the superintendent and staff reports. And I think we're starting with Alma Laura and a Native American Month presentation.
Board Chair Meisner, board members, and Superintendent Dr. Heil, thank you for being here today. I'll do my presentation as well in my native tongue so we can all hear that. Tonalte ite michu Alma Laura, Chanchumbe 25 años, Madada, Manana, Mengua, Talgo Simapan, y Guia Nu Ana. So I said, thank you and welcome everyone to our meeting here today. My name is Alma Laura and I am 25 years old. My parents descend from Hidalgo Simapan from the Otomi Nation. So we'll go ahead and get started with our presentation here.
We're actually waiting on our presentation to come up, so.
Just kidding.
Yeah. Do you want to go and share what month it is?
Yes, so it is Native American Heritage Month, and we are super excited that it is this month, but we also acknowledge that we can celebrate outside of November and can celebrate in any month all our cultural diversities. So with that, we'll go ahead and get started with our presentation here. Can I use this? Okay. Down. Maybe? Okay. So we'll start off with our Fridley Public School land acknowledgement. We collectively acknowledge that Minnesota is located on the traditional, ancestral, contemporary, and occupied lands of the Dakota Oyate and Ojibwe Anishinaabe indigenous peoples. We make this acknowledgement to honor and respect the Ojibwe Anishinaabe and Dakota Oyate peoples, the original stewards of the lands and waters, their ancestors, descendants, traditions, as well as the land itself. We have a moral responsibility to advocate and be in alliance with our indigenous communities as we continue our equity and inclusion journey. And we want to also acknowledge that the land acknowledgement is not just for the peoples who have inhabited the lands here, but as well as acknowledging that we honor and respect our indigenous lands and the earth itself. Is far much more than just the land. It's everything that's included. And one of our ancestral teachings in the Nawa Mexica Nation is honoring and respecting everything that surrounds you. Only in this way you will live in harmony with life. And so the gentleman that's going to be speaking, he'll talk a little bit more about that.
what I've learned from my elders is that when we do acknowledgement of the land, it's not about acknowledging whose land it belongs to, because that indigenous worldview, we never owned the land. We were simply caretakers of it for future generations. And what I've been taught from my elders is that when we do that acknowledgement of the land, it's much more than just the territory. It's about relationships. It's about our relationships with people that share the land. It's our relationships with Mother Earth. It's our relationships with the four-legged, the finned, the feathered, the crawlers, the original stewards of Mother Earth. It's that relationship that we acknowledge with the trees. It's that acknowledgement that we have with the plant life that is part of the food chain and helps us exist. It gives us our medicines for healing, gives us food for nutrients, it gives us our medicines for ceremonies. We acknowledge water. Water is sacred, water is life. And what we're told is that when we acknowledge that water, that we always have to acknowledge the carriers of those teachings, which are the woman. So we do that in the same voice. We also acknowledge the infinite wisdom of the grandfathers. Then we take that to the next level, is which acknowledging that relationship that we have with father-son, or in some nations, brother-son. We acknowledge that relationship that we have with Nokomis, Grandma Moon, and how she cleanses Mother Earth. We acknowledge that relationship that we have with our distant relations, the star people. So when we talk about acknowledging the land, it's so much more so than just acknowledging what nation was on that. As we know all throughout the history of Turtle Island, is that Indigenous people were, for the most part, nomadic people. They shifted. They would move from season to season. It just so happens that Sheridan sits on the treaty territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit, which I'm very proud to always share and educate with people. But in the same breath, I also acknowledge that many, many other nations have walked this territory, and that their ancestors are still here amongst us.
Awesome. And so with that, we always acknowledge that the land acknowledgement is much more than just acknowledging the peoples that were here, but also everything and anything that's on Mother Earth. So with that, we'll go into what recognizing a tribe federally recognized in the U.S. is. As defined, the United States recognizes a government-to-government relationship with a tribe, that a tribe exists politically in a domestic dependent nation status, meaning some tribes are thankfully recognized in the United States as federally recognized, and we also recognize that there are many nations that are not federally recognized, not just within the United States, but in the world as well. And so we always want to make that acknowledgement that it is amazing that we have this that is going on in the U.S., but also realizing some of our nations are not federally recognized. And with that, we acknowledge that there are 11 federally recognized tribes in Minnesota, and one of our more well-known recognized tribes here in Minnesota that's closest to us in the Fridley Public School Districts is the Shakopee Mdewakanton Sioux community. And so they're one of our closest ones to us here, but we do recognize that there are 11. And then the following slides just give us the location where the tribes are located. So we have Red Lake, Bois Fort, Grand Portage, White Earth, Fond du Lac, Mille Lacs, Shakopee Mdewakanton, Upper Sioux, Lower Sioux, Prairie Island, and Leech Lake. And as you can see on the map here, they have different locations throughout the state, and we welcome you to visit and get to know where these communities come from and their cultural backgrounds and traditions. Some of them are located on very beautiful lands like Bemidji, and so we definitely recommend, if you have the opportunity to visit these places, you feel free to please do so. And then the following information is just a little bit about where these tribes are located in Minnesota, as well as some information of their story of where they come from, when they were established, and so on and so forth. And these are just the first four. The next slide shows the next four. And then the final slide shows the last two. And you are also welcome to learn more about them either on social media platforms like their websites, or going on our Minnesota government page, as they also have our 11 federally recognized tribes. And with that leads us into a powwow. What you might see at a powwow, powwow has been a term that's been used in many different forms. One as a gathering of people, but powwows are very sacred and very respected within the Native and Indigenous communities. It's a place where ceremonies can take place. It's a place where people come to find healing, a place where many nations come together, and the powwow is just much more than what we just think of as a place where people go and dance and share foods and buy stuff. It's much more than that for a lot of Indigenous communities. Some of the common things you might see at a powwow could be some of the dancing, the drums, the songs, vendors, food. Yes, it is that, but there is more to that, especially our dancers who are offering their dances, the ceremonies that take place, and so on and so forth in a powwow. And then we also acknowledge that the powwow is very, very important to the Indigenous communities. And if you ever get a chance to attend one, we highly recommend you do so for your own informational purposes if you want to learn more about that. And with our next slide here, we want to acknowledge that we speak of Native American or Indigenous peoples as a present term, as they are and not as they were, because as much as some of our customs have adapted to times, we still very much exist, and we're still very much resilient in existing and coexisting with our lives now. A lot of Indigenous communities are spoken of as past tense, but a lot of Indigenous communities are still existing, and we want to acknowledge that they still exist and are still very much here. And educating ourselves on knowing that they are still very much here is very important. Lakota Elder Dottie says, opening yourself to another worldview will assist you in understanding what occurs both in the outside of Native communities. And so that is very important. Dottie is a very well-known elder in our communities as Indigenous peoples. Strong advocate with education is our strongest tool, and using that to the best of our advantage to learn about our communities as Indigenous peoples, as Native Americans, as people in general. It's the strongest tool that we can obtain. And our next slide here, we'll talk a little bit about people that you may know from Minnesota or are residing in Minnesota. First and foremost, Peggy Flanagan, our lieutenant, is one of the highest ranking Native American women in the government. She is amazing with the work that she has done, outspoken person for her Indigenous community, does not hide her culture, very much proud of her culture. And so we're very thankful to have someone, especially as a woman figure in the government, who is proud of her roots and carries that with her proudly throughout her work. Another person that you may know is Sean Sherman. He's the founder of Sue Chef and his Indigenous Food Lab. He has amazing work that he's done with sharing the traditions of different herbs and different foods that are naturally grown and that we can use in our food resources, and works proudly with schools and youth. And so he's very well known in our communities and offering opportunities for folks to learn about the traditional ways of creating foods and offering our food to people outside of the Indigenous communities as well. And then our final person that you might also recognize is Winona LaDuke. She is an amazing, amazing activist who's proud to support Indigenous lands and the land that we are on, and protecting what we can and continue to use as a natural resource, primarily focused on farming in her own lands, as well as protecting the waters that we so sacredly need to keep caring for as much as we can, as much as possible, just because there is very little water that has not been contaminated, and we want to keep those waters protected as much as we can. So Winona LaDuke is an amazing person, resides here. Her roots start here as an Indigenous person, grew up in different areas of the world, but has come back and resides here in Minnesota as well. And to close us off, we'll watch a quick video. I also want to acknowledge that in Native American Heritage Month, we also have Native American Heritage Day, and that falls the day after Thanksgiving that is celebrated as a custom here in the U.S. And knowing that Native American Heritage Day is very important to Native American peoples and indigenous peoples. So go ahead and close with the video. Board Chair Meisner, board members, and Superintendent Dr. Heil, Padush, Glasukamati, thank you for listening, and we hope to continue to hold space together. Thank you. Oh, for Native American Heritage Day is November 25th.
November 25th. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Glasukamati.
And
Just want to acknowledge that your presentation has been very helpful in educating us about the contributions of the Native American community. And as a first-generation immigrant to the United States, I'm in awe at the relationships and the stewardness of the earth that you have shared with us. That's kind of part of the Native American culture. And at the same time, I kind of felt pain when you use words like we still exist, we're still there. That must be very painful, I'm sure. So my hope is that as you've ended with a hopeful note, that will reach a point when everybody will be so proud of the Native American contribution and how we've all benefited from the resources. And we can say we are thriving and we are really respected, community in the United States and in our state and so on. So I just want to acknowledge that the families and the students who are in Fridley Public Schools hopefully will teach us and make all of us to be better people. So thank you so much for being here. Appreciate you.
that was very nicely said. Thank you. And now for the follow-up act on that, the next business item, maybe slightly less colorful and interesting, I don't know, is the audit review with Craig and his people, I believe.
Chair Meisner, board members, Dr. Heil, we finished the 21-22 audit, and to present the results of those findings, we have Janelle Bitson from Bergen KDV. And I'll let her take over and do the presentation for you.
Thank you, Chair Meisner, members of the board, for the opportunity to once again work with the Fridley School District. I have the results of the 2022 audit. First wanted to start off with the audit reports that we issue as part of our audit process. The first one being the independent auditor's report. We did issue an unmodified opinion. This is what's considered a clean opinion or the best that we can offer you on your statements. The report states that your financial statements present fairly in all material respects. The second report we issue is our report on government auditing standards. These standards require us to look at the internal controls that you have over financial reporting. We had one internal control item to report, and that's the lack of segregation of accounting duties due to the limited staff that you have within the finance office. You've seen this in the past, and it is again listed at that mid-level finding. The district does have some compensating controls in place to kind of oversee some of those overlaps of duties. These standards also require us to look at compliance with various laws, regulations, contracts, and grants, and we had no items of non-compliance to report. The third report that we issue is our report on uniform guidance. Just back on the back slide again. And this is our report on federal funding. We are required to do some federal funding test work. We tested the education stabilization funds this year, and we issued an unmodified opinion on the compliance with the requirements of that program. And then the last report we issue is our report on Minnesota legal compliance. The state auditor's office gives us a list of state statutes that they want us to test compliance with, and we had no items of non-compliance, so another clean report for the district. And then moving on, we do have some charts and graphs that relate to your student numbers, because a large component of your general fund revenues, about 75% of your revenues, are state sources of revenues, and a lot of them dependent on the number of students that you have. We like to present this information. So the first table here is your resident ADM numbers for the last 5 years. For 2022, you did have an increase in your resident ADM numbers by about 2.98%. The graph following that is the same information. You can see a little more clearly here that you've had some decreases in your resident numbers leading up to 2022, when you had that increase again after those few years of declines. And then the next tables here, the top part of the graph or table here is the weighting factors. So some of the aids that are paid to the district are paid based on these weighting factors. Your secondary students are earning you a little bit more aids than some of the lower level grades. So converting those ADM numbers to pupil unit numbers using those weighting factors, you did have an increase in your resident pupil unit numbers along with that increase in the ADMs. However, you also had an increase in the residents leaving the district and a decrease in the non-residents coming in. So an overall decrease in the pupil units served of about 2.1%. The district does continue to have a net gain of the open enrollment program, but that net gain has decreased in the years presented here. So back in 2018, you had a net gain of about 640 pupil units compared to about 342 in 2022. And then the graph here charts out the pupil units, residents compared to non-residents. So your non-residents make up about 40% of your pupil units that are served within the district. And then the following graph charts out the change that you've had in your ADM and pupil units served for the last 5 years. And your pupil units served number has decreased in 4 of the 5 years presented here. Following that, we have a general fund budget to actual comparison. So the first 2 columns of numbers, again, are the board approved budget. So the final amended budget in the second column called for a decrease in your fund balance of about $1.6 million. The actual was a decrease of about $2.4 million. Your revenues were about $310,000 over budget. The largest component of that was the federal sources of revenue. The district historically has budgeted conservatively for those revenues, not knowing which grants that they would use or spend during the year. And then partially offsetting that was your state sources of revenue, which were under budget because the enrollment decline was a little bit higher than anticipated. Your expenditures were about $1.3 million over budget. The federal grant piece was a large component of that. Again, those dollars are dollars that you have to spend to be able to get those reimbursements for that. Other areas that came in over budget were unemployment benefits, transportation costs being higher than anticipated, as well as some repairs and maintenance items. So again, overall the fund balance decreased about $2.4 million compared to a budgeted decrease of $1.6 million. The next table breaks out the components of the general fund revenue. Overall, they decreased about $447,000. The largest component of that decrease was in the other category, specifically the federal sources of revenue. With the district using more of the COVID grants in 2021, you had more of those dollars recognized in the prior year. And then the pie charts here break out the different expenditures by program, kind of comparing where you were allocating your dollars in 2022 compared to 2021. Overall, the percentages are very consistent in where you've been spending your dollars. And then the next table summarizes the general fund operations for the last 5 years. Revenues decreased about 0.9% and expenditures increased about 9%. Some of the larger, more significant factors in the increase in expenditures related to contract settlements and retention bonuses, increased busing with having the students back in session in person, and then some of the repairs and maintenance and boiler replacements. So your expenditures did exceed revenues by about $2.3 million. You did receive some proceeds of other financing sources such as leases and finance purchases, and then some dollars transferred out to other funds. So overall, a decrease in fund balance of about $2.4 million. And the table at the bottom here breaks out the different components of your fund balance. Most of that decrease was in the assigned categories and the long-term facility maintenance restriction. And then the graph here, the green line is your total fund balance. You can see that that number had been building up for a couple years, and then there was the decrease that we've talked about in 2022. And a reminder that most of that was a planned decrease. You had dollars set aside for projects and some of the federal funds that were being set aside for specific purposes as well. So not a surprise to most of you that that decrease happened. Again, it was a part of the budget. And then the next table is the food service operations. Both revenues and expenditures increased with more meals being served. Revenues increased at a little bit higher rate because of a higher increase in the federal reimbursement. So revenues did exceed expenditures in this fund by about $365,000, which you were able to add to your fund balance at the end of the year. And then this table just shows the meals served for the last 5 years. 2021 was lower with the kids not being in session and with the pandemic and such. And then in 2022, back increased with kids being back in school. The green line does indicate that all students were on the free meal program during 2022. And then the last table here summarizes the Community Service Fund. Again, in this fund, both revenues and expenditures increased with more programs being able to happen post-pandemic after the limitations were lifted. Expenditures did exceed revenue by about $422,000. There was a transfer in from the general fund to allocate some of the operating referendum and lease dollars, but an overall decrease in your fund balance of about $267,000. All of the components of the fund balance did decrease a little bit, but the majority of that decrease is in the community education program. So kind of a quick summary again for 2022. Certainly open if anyone has any additional questions. All right, thank you.
Although I would just like to acknowledge our superintendent and finance team for another clean audit and good financial steering of our district. Thank you for that. Abdislam recognizes the people and I recognize the dollars. Funny how that works. Also, Dr. Heil, was I intercepting, and were you going to do some introductions on those last two? I was jumping right into the agenda, so okay, great. All right, moving on to the next item. The motion to approve the audit report that we just heard the summary report from and that we have in front of us here on our tables. Any discussion about the audit?
I agree, it was really good. I'll make the motion to approve.
And we have a motion and a second. And if there's no other discussion about the audit or the finances, then all in favor of approving the audit, say aye. Aye. All opposed? And that is unanimous. Second, we have a resolution in front of us, Dr. Heil.
Chair Meisner and board members, we're asking for approval this evening for consolidated polling place here at Fridley Community Center. This is an annual resolution, and it is for if there's a need of any special elections that would come up, the polling place would be taking place here, combined and held at Fridley Community Center. So we're asking approval for that this evening.
Very good, and we have that resolution in front of us on our handouts. Does anybody have any questions about this resolution? There's a motion to approve and a second. So we have a motion and a second to approve the resolution for the consolidated polling places here at the school. All in favor of accepting the resolution, say aye. Aye. Any opposed? And that is unanimous. Our next motion is the second reading and adoption of some policies, and we will call on our staff. It looks like we're starting with Dr. Bodie.
Good evening, Board Chair Meisner, board members, and Superintendent Dr. Heil. I'm here tonight to present to you the second reading of 3 different policies. First one being Policy 601, School District Curriculum and Instructional Goals. In this particular policy, there are no additions since the first reading. The second one is Policy 603, Curriculum Development. Again, no changes to since the first reading. And then Policy 604, there is one slight change to this policy since the first reading. It is found on page 4. Under number 8, we wanted to add the language around apprenticeship programs. So number 8 would read, help identifying collaborative partnerships among pre-kindergarten through grade 12 schools, post-secondary institutions, economic development agencies, apprenticeship programs, and local and regional employers that support students' transition to post-secondary education and employment and provide students with applied and experiential learning opportunities. All right, thank you.
Thank you, Board Chair Meisner, board members, Superintendent Dr. Heil. Dr. Bodie is certainly a tough act to follow. It's my privilege to provide the second readings of Policy 515.1 and Policy 722. That said, there are no changes since the first reading, and that concludes the second reading of these policies. Brief indeed, sir, yes.
Motions in front of us from the second reading. Any questions or comments or discussion on these motions? Motion to approve. There's a motion to approve. And a second. And so, with no further discussion, all in favor of accepting these 5 policies, say aye. Aye. All opposed? And that is unanimous. Our next item of business is one reading adoption and adoption of policies. These are non-substantive changes, and so we'll just have a single reading. And we'll start off with Dr. Howe.
Thank you. Yes. Due to legislative changes, we are asking for adoption of policies with one reading, and we have 7 policies. The first one is policies 104, school district, and what occurred with that policy, it was just the rule citation was deleted off of this policy. Then we have several more.
And then we're going to have a little tour of people. Mr. Isaacson.
Thank you, Board Chair Meisner, board members, Superintendent Dr. Heil, and certainly Mr. Meisner, with respect to brevity, this will be brief. With the reference that Dr. Heil made to the changes, this is a single reading policy, and the only change to policy 404, employment background checks, relates to the legal references cited in the policy. That is the only change.
Thank you.
Members, Superintendent Heil, as Dr. Heil had mentioned, these are one reading policies based on MSBA policy 208, and I have 3 policies. The first one is policy 420, which is students and employees with sexually transmitted infections and diseases and certain other communicable diseases and infectious conditions. The only thing is there's just some statute changes within that policy. So that's the only thing that's changed with that. 506, student discipline. There are some references to statutes throughout the policy and also in the reference section, so that is the only change to that policy. And section 508, extended school year for certain students with individualized education programs. The changes are just to the references in that policy.
Board Chair Meisner, board members, and Superintendent Dr. Heil. Again, I'm also here to present to you 2 one-reading policies. First one is policy 509, enrollment of non-resident students. The only changes within this are removing the abbreviations of chapter and subdivision and writing the actual word out, and then some updates to the legal references. And then policy 517, student recruiting. There's just one, at the end of it, just one removal of a cross-reference. And that is all there is to those. Thank you.
So just as a reminder to public and our extensive audience here in the room, these are just small administrative changes to the policies, which is why they're a single reading. Assuming there's no discussion on these minor changes, then I will move we approve them. And without further discussion, all in favor of accepting these single reading policy changes, say aye. Aye. All opposed? And that is unanimous. Our next item is the consent agenda, which is the consent of routine action items, including minutes of the work sessions and business meetings held on October 18th, monthly financial reports, new contracts, amendments, leaves of absence, resignations, retirements and terminations, and an MOA with the custodians regarding double time pay. Assuming there's no discussion on the consent agenda, all in favor of accepting the consent agenda, say aye. Aye. Any opposed? That is unanimous. And now we get to move into the first readings of policies. And again, we're going to start with Dr. Bodie.
Board Chair Meisner, board members, and Superintendent Dr. Heil. I'm here tonight to present to you 2 first readings of policy. First one is 610 field trips. Just an update to this policy on page 2, adding section E, which talks about an employee not using a personal vehicle to transport one or more students for purposes of a field trip, unless there is an emergency or unforeseen circumstance, such as illness or injury of a child, and that personal vehicle should be properly registered and insured. And then if that were to happen, then the employee must obtain pre-approval by administration to transport that student. And if that is unable to be acquired in the time frame, then they would need to report out on that upon return. And then also, superintendent shall provide a report to the school board at least annually about any of those occurrences. And then policy 612 around development of parent and family policies for Title I programs. No significant changes other than under section 3, which is on page 2, or section 3, part E on page 2. Just removing the first sentence. It's a redundant sentence from section D, and just for flow of the reading of the policy, it just makes sense to remove that language. That is all. Thank you.
From Mr. Weaver.
Good evening, Chair Meisner, board members, Dr. Heil, Superintendent. I have 3 policies that we're presenting for first reading here. Policy 708, transportation of non-public students. This policy is being altered to include some conforming changes to MSBA model policies. It also adds requirements around information being available for disabled students that are being transported by the district. These are conforming changes. The policy, the language already exists in this policy for regular students of the district. These are non students that aren't being served by the district, but we still have to provide transportation for them. That's what those amendments kind of brings that together. Policy 709 is student transportation safety. This is largely adopting statutory changes, technical references to rules and updated statutes. Also, it aligns Fridley's policies with the fact that we contract for our bus services. We don't employ the drivers themselves. MSBA has changed their model policy on this. We are choosing to adopt the portions of it that apply just for contracted services. If the district ever goes back to having our own bus drivers and employing those in-house, we'd have to come back and alter this, but that's kind of what we're adopting there. And the final policy, 898, is a lease accounting policy. What this does, it establishes a reporting limitation for the finance department for GASB 87. GASB 87 is a standard that began being implemented this year. It requires districts on their financial statements to allocate their lease costs between principal and interest and amortize that over the life of the lease. By implementing this policy, we're basically saying everything with a lease that's below $10,000 doesn't have to be reported on. We've consulted with Bergen KDV, our auditor, on this. They suggested this policy and the limitation for it. The fact that we're adopting it now means that we can, in our audit, we can report those leases following this policy. We just have to have it in place before the end of this year, which is why it's being presented now. And so that's why that's the genesis for this. Any questions?
Then we will revisit them in a month. The last item on the agenda is the upcoming important future school dates. We have the Fridley High School Fall Musical Newsies that we heard a preview of last time. November 17, 18, 19th, and I think we're missing a date here, 20th maybe? There's at least 4 days. No? Just 3 days? Oh, because we're already... Thank you for that. So we got 3 more days coming up is what I meant to say. 17, 18, and 19th at 7 p.m. in the auditorium. Thanksgiving holiday is November 24th and 25th. There will be no school those 2 days. The Schools for Equity and Education meeting is December 2nd at 9:30 a.m. at the Doubletree in Roseville. Free movie night, family movie night. The movie is Bad Guys. That doesn't sound like a very good role model, but I won't be judgmental. And that is December 2nd at 7 p.m. at the high school auditorium. Fridley School Board work session is December 6th at 5 p.m. This time it is at the Fridley High School. It is not here at the community center. And we'll be meeting a half hour early at 5 p.m. again at the Fridley High School. The Fridley Public School Board meeting, the next one is December 20th, starting again at 5:30. That is here at the community center. Then 7 o'clock will be our Truth in Taxation meeting, followed by a 7:30 standard business meeting, again here at the community center. There's nothing else on the agenda, so
Motion move to adjourn the meeting.
we have a motion to adjourn. And we have a second. With no further discussion, all in favor of adjourning, say aye.
Aye.
No opposed? That's unanimous. Thank you all.